Good afternoon, SproutsCasters. How are you doing today? Welcome to SproutsCast Tuesday edition story time. Hi, Mrs. Good.
Hello, Mr. Good. How are you?
I'm well. I'm, enjoying getting back to church. It's been good. We met last week with our small group on Thursday, so that was fabulous. And then a whole bunch of people were here on Sunday. And did you hear that announcement Pastor made about being able to open up?
And I'm so excited to be able to come back and see all of our friends. I've missed everybody so much.
Yeah, missed all you guys. There was a couple people that I talked to on Sunday that I was like, oh, I haven't talked to you in like 6 months. You know, it was wonderful being able to talk to people. So
it was, and I was really thankful that we had so many people here this last Sunday, and I was even more excited because we actually had visitors.
We did. We had some visitors.
With us right after the quarantine ends, and we get visitors coming in, so that was so awesome. It was just good to see everybody.
Yeah, it was. It was really good to see everybody, all the visitors, and everything is just wonderful. So we are, how about let's talk a little bit about the pictures that people are supposed to draw this week.
For Thursday. This is Tuesday, so you guys need to have this picture ready for Thursday. And if I remember right, you're supposed to draw a picture of some sort, and you are supposed to write at the top,
or the bottom,
church.
Or the side.
Is it I love church because?
Yeah.
Is that what it is? I love church because, and then you either need to draw a picture as to why you love church, and then write underneath as well, or just draw a picture and write why you like church.
Draw a picture of this beautiful face, why you love church. Mr. Good, that's why.
Well, some of the kids might say that. I know there's some kids that are always saying, Mr. Good, Mr. Good. So you could be a reason. I don't know. We'll see.
Well, either way, draw a picture and make sure you go to last Thursday's SproutsCast with Pastor and Mr. Tyler and put it in the comments. And then who knows, they may put it up on screen this upcoming Thursday so everybody can see it. So draw a picture. I love church because, and there you go. And so what are we doing today, Mrs. Good?
Today we are going to continue reading in our story about Jim Elliott, missionary to Ecuador. And
where is Ecuador, Mrs. Good?
So I actually looked it up because I wasn't 100% sure if it was in Central America or South America or exactly where it is, but it's right up at the top, on the top left-hand corner of South America.
Yeah, on the western shore in between Colombia and Peru. Peru like wraps around like this. And Colombia comes out of Central America, and then Ecuador is right there. Well, I guess it would be on this side, but regardless, anyway. Fabulous. Well, why don't we just jump into it and get it knocked out?
All right. Well, we'll go ahead and continue our book, One Great Purpose, on Jim Elliott. And last week we left off after the Angry River chapter, and that one was pretty crazy. Everything in the entire camp was destroyed by the river flooding from all the rain that they had, and they were panicking, trying to get all their stuff salvaged as much as they could, and one of them they actually thought almost died. Remember that? And he had to get a machete and chop his way through the roof of the building in order to get back in. So we're going to continue on right after that. This is chapter 9, and it is called A New Direction. It continued to rain for 2 more days. There was nothing Jim and Pete could do but sit in the hospitable Quechua's hut and watch. Then, finally, the rain retreated. But as the sun came out, the jungle turned into a giant steam oven. Millions of gallons of water kept evaporating and condensating on the leaves of the tallest trees. Jim longed for the kind of crisp, dry sunshine that would dry their papers and their clothing. With the end of the rain came the job of figuring out what exactly had been saved from the flood and assessing the extent of the water damage. A quick count of the McCauley's barrels revealed that there were now only 10 of the original 11. Jim sighed. The missing barrel had probably been stolen. Jim had known there was such a risk, but there was nothing they could do to prevent it. Rather than worry about what was missing, he decided to be grateful for all the things that had survived. Jim's resolve to be grateful quickly evaporated, though, when he noticed the wire for the radio aerial was missing. He distinctly remembered placing it near the top of the red box in which the radio had been stacked. Without the aerial, he wouldn't be able to send a call to Shelmera and update Marge Saint on the state of their circumstances. Thanks to Betty, Jim had an alternative to fall back on in getting a message to the outside world, even if it was a lot slower. After hearing Jim's last radio message to Shelmera, Betty had persuaded one of the Indians at Dos Rios to trek to Shandai and investigate how Jim was getting on. The man had arrived the night before with a letter for Jim and a loaf of Betty's homemade bread. Jim was amazed by the determination of his fiancée. He hadn't even considered sending a messenger out to Pano or Shelmera with news, because he doubted he could find anyone willing to risk such a trek with the river flooded. Yet somehow, Betty had convinced someone to take a letter for her to Shandai. Now the messenger could take a letter back to Betty and let her know the fate of Shandai. All Jim needed was a pen and some paper. He cast his eyes about the chaos surrounding him. Where would he find a pen and a piece of dry paper? The items weren't easy to find, but after some hunting through several boxes, he managed to find a few usable sheets of paper. The paper was limp, but not too wet to write on. He sat down under a tree and began to write. Holding nothing back, he told Betty everything that had happened. "Shandai is no more," he began. "The first house went about 3:30 p.m. on Thursday." The letter brought a swift response. Within 24 hours, Betty had trekked through the jungle to get to Jim. With her was a small band of Quechua Christians from Dos Rios. Once again, Betty surprised Jim with her determination and courage, and right away she set to work sorting and hanging things on bushes to dry. Jim was, of course, thrilled to have her with him, but he found it difficult to concentrate on her conversations. He kept drifting off. At first, he put it down to tiredness. He hadn't slept much the past couple weeks. But even after a good night's sleep, he felt dizzy and vaguely out of touch with reality. The next day, more help arrived. This time it was Dr. Tidmarsh and Nate Saint who had flown to Pano, where they had left the plane and hiked the rest of the way. Dr. Tidmarsh took one look at Jim and ordered him to lie down. "Malaria," he said, shaking his head. "You must have caught it while you were moving things to safety. You need complete bed rest." For once, Jim did not argue. He climbed onto a pile of bedding and lay down. Dr. Tidmarsh then unwrapped the strips of torn bed sheets that Jim had bound around his feet. As he did so, Jim's mind drifted off, and for the next week, Jim was in and out of consciousness. In the meantime, Nate Saint returned to Shelmera to collect Ed McCauley, who had come down from Quito to survey the damage. After a week of rest, Jim felt well enough to get up for short periods. During these times, he joined in discussions about what to do next. Jim, Pete, and Ed McCauley began to ask themselves some serious questions. Now that there was nothing left of Shandai, would they rebuild it in the same place? Was God perhaps trying to get their attention and lead them to a better place? Jim felt those questions could be answered only by traveling to other areas in Quechua territory and searching for a more suitable site. He and Pete had lived at Shandai for nearly a year, but because of all the building and language studies, neither of them had traveled far from the immediate area. Now that all their responsibilities had been swept away by the river, they had time to explore to see if God might be leading them somewhere new. Betty waved from the bank of the river as the three men climbed into a dugout canoe with several Quechua Indians. The plan was to spend 2 or 3 weeks plying the waterways that crisscrossed Quechua territory and find a suitable location for a new mission station. Betty had agreed to stay behind in a tent and watch over their belongings. Several days into the journey, they paddled down the Puyo River to the point where it met with the Pastaza River. At the junction of the two rivers, Jim spotted a group of huts. "Let's pull in here," he suggested. An hour later, the three missionaries were squatting together outside one of the huts, talking to a small Quechua man who had introduced himself as Atanasio. That's a hard one to say. Atanasio. The man didn't seem at all afraid of the three strangers and quite happily told them about his life. Atanasio explained that he lived in the hut with his 2 wives and 15 children. Jim smiled. He'd already noticed several pairs of eyes staring shyly from behind the bushes. Atanasio invited the group to stay for lunch. One of his wives spread a banana leaf in front of the guests and then loaded boiled manioc onto it from an aluminum pot that hung over the fire. As they chewed away on the manioc, Atanasio looked directly at Jim and said more as a statement than a question. "You will come back? You will open school for my children." "What did he say?" asked Ed McCauley, who understood only a few words of Quechua. "He's inviting us back. He wants us to start a school for his children," said Jim. The three men looked at each other. This was a rare invitation indeed. It normally took a long time to win the trust of Indians, and even longer to be invited to live among them. Could this be where God was leading? Is this where they were supposed to set up a new mission station? It certainly seemed possible. For the next week, the men thought and talked about the invitation as they paddled down the rivers. By the time they arrived back at Shandai, 21 days after setting out, they had a plan. Jim took Betty aside to explain it to her. "As we see it, we've already invested a lot of work here in Shandai. The Indians know and trust us, and we shouldn't give that up. It makes sense for Ed and Marilou to move here, especially since they don't know the language yet, and the Indians here are used to having missionaries around. Of course, Ed will need either Pete or me to stay with him, at least until he knows enough of the Quechua language to get by." Betty nodded. Jim continued. "We also think Atanasio's invitation is a sign from God that we should begin a station down there, too. It would take 2 people to start the station. The sensible thing would be for Pete to stay here with Ed and Marilou, and for me to start the new station. But I'll need a partner. So," Jim drew in a deep breath, "how soon will you marry me?" October 8th, 1953, was Jim's 26th birthday. It was also his wedding day. Neither he nor Betty had wanted the usual wedding with bridesmaids, cake, and bouquets of flowers. The ceremony was performed at the Registro Civil, an old colonial building in the heart of Quito. Dr. Tidmarsh, his wife, and Ed and Marilou McCauley were the only witnesses. The whole event took less than 10 minutes. The new Mr. and Mrs. Elliott flew to Panama for their honeymoon and then on to Costa Rica, where they dropped in on Betty's brother Dave and his wife Phil, who were missionaries there. Both Jim and Betty enjoyed surprising them. Dave and Phil were certainly surprised, especially when they found out that Jim and Betty were married. Once back in Quito, Jim and Betty directed their energy towards preparing to set up a new mission station at Puyupungu, as Atanasio's little clearing was called. Many of the supplies Jim had originally brought with him from the United States had never been unpacked. They hadn't yet been needed, and so were still stored safely away at the Gospel Missionary Union compound in Quito. Almost like opening wedding presents, the newlyweds rummaged through the collection of things looking for anything useful. They found several aluminum pans and containers, an assortment of garden tools, and a tiny portable stove, all of which would certainly be of use in setting up a new home. They packed the items carefully into boxes that had been lined with thick, waterproof paper. Soon, all the arrangements had been made, and the young couple were on their way to their first home. Jim and Betty caught the bus to Shelmera, where they stayed the night. The following morning, Nate Saint drove them to the end of the road that led in the direction of Puyupungu. The road ended abruptly at the river. They all piled out of the pickup, and Jim squinted into the morning sun, searching for the canoes he'd arranged to have meet them and take them downriver. A wave of relief swept over him when he spotted them waiting on the far side. After the Indians had paddled across the river, the group began loading the Elliott's belongings into the canoes. A folding bed, a steel trunk, the boxes, and a tent were all expertly balanced in the center of the canoes. With a wave from Nate Saint, Jim, Betty, and their Indian friends were on their way down the muddy river. About halfway to their destination, a group of Quechua Indians from Puyupungu had paddled upstream to meet them and escort them to their new home. As the canoes were pulled onto the beach, Jim smiled. Once again, he caught a glimpse of a small brown face eyeing him from the bushes. He squeezed Betty's hand and pointed to a little girl who quickly disappeared beneath the undergrowth. Atanasio came out of his hut to meet Jim and Betty Elliott as though he were a king welcoming important people into his realm. He waved his hand toward a hut, a small bamboo structure with a thatched roof. "It is for you," he said grandly. Jim smiled and thanked him. With all the other things he and Betty had to do, it was a relief to know they wouldn't have to worry about housing. An hour later, Jim and Betty's belongings were piled inside the quaint home. Atanasio's wives and some of the braver children took turns peeking through the doorway to see what was going on inside. Then, something happened that Jim hadn't expected. Gifts began to arrive. One Indian brought a bunch of plantains. Another brought smoked fish wrapped in a banana leaf. And yet another carried in a pile of firewood and 2 papayas. The new couple now had their dinner, but more than that, they had a sign that they were really welcome. They were among friends. Everything seemed perfect as Jim and Betty went to bed that first night. The couple had plenty of food, friendly neighbors, and a roof over their head. It was, however, the roof that proved to be the problem. For one thing, it was too low for these Americans to stand up straight under. After all, they were both about a foot taller than the average Indian. But they had expected that. What they hadn't expected was to be rained on by cockroaches. As the night progressed, hundreds of roaches dropped from the thatched roof onto them. Jim could feel Betty shuddering beside him as she flicked the bugs off. After a sleepless night, Jim and Betty decided to leave the hut to the roaches. They pitched their 16-foot-long tent nearby. The tent had no floor, and anything touching the sides got wet when it rained. But it was roach-free. And not only that, the two of them could stand up in it. Once they had arranged the tent, they were ready to begin their new life together at Puyupungu and face whatever the future held for them. That is the end of chapter 10. We're going to go ahead and leave it off there. Next week, our chapter will be called Outstations, chapter 10, and we will see exactly what happens in that chapter next week. Remember to go ahead and get your pictures drawn for Thursday, and we will go ahead and look at those, and maybe they'll be able to put a couple of them up for you on Thursday afternoon so that you guys can see what everybody's favorite thing about church is. So we will see you next week. I hope you guys have a great week.